Welcome, gentle reader, to this episode of Everything is Everything. That is the great Amit Varma, and I am Ajay. Okay, today we're going to take you on a rollicking riot. But before the rollicking riot, I have to give you some setting, some principles, some philosophy. Okay, this is in the hot, exciting subject of measurement. Okay, so ever since uh, the beginnings of knowledge and science at Kepler and Newton, we have known a basic journey that you do measurement, you improve the measurement, then you find statistical regularities in the data, that is Kepler's laws, and then you get to Newton and you do theory. But this is the journey. You always start at the data. If you don't have the data, you don't have anything. Then it's just conversation. We can argue with each other with our own opinions. We're just like wasting hot air. The beginning of knowledge is measurement, and so we prize measurement above all, and particularly in a place like India where frankly very little is well measured in India. There is a supreme need of a greater prioritization of measurement. Now, in the game of measurement, there is a traditional industrialized large complex institutions approach to measurement, which is like a government statistical system, things like the CSO, the Central Statistical Organization, or things like the CMIE, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. They make vast complex data sets. They have 50 years of institutional focus on how to build high quality data, and that's great. Traditionally, these have been the only game in town. Now, in the last 20 years, there is a revolution sweeping in the world of measurement where all kinds of new possibilities are opening up. It's literally like new eyes being brought to the world where we see new kinds of things. We see things that we never imagined could be seen before. Previously, we had done one episode around nighttime lights data and being able to peer into Russia, and a bunch of Indian experts are able to look at the Russian economy and arrive at novel levels of knowledge about what is going on in the Russian economy. This is unimaginable. The traditional institutional measurement mechanisms, okay, like a CSO or a CMIE, couldn't have done that. It is a bird in the sky. It's a satellite looking down into Russia that is able to see things, which puts you in a different level altogether. But you ain't seen nothing yet. We can go way, way beyond that. There are all kinds of wonderful things that have happened in the world of measurement. And in this episode, we're going to take you down some of this rollicking journey. So, Amit, tell us what you have in store for us today.
First of all, you are very confused. I'm not Amit, I'm Amit for you. Yeah, just as you are Ajay and not Ajoy. Right? Two can play this game.
Oh, joy.
Oh, no, Ajoy. Kindly control, kindly control. No, but just as you eloquently said that the road to knowledge begins with data, and I would say the road to knowledge ends in despair. But leaving that aside, once you get the knowledge, you realize what the world is really like. But leaving that aside, I really enjoyed our last episode on nighttime lights, where you explained how you arrived at that field of study, and that particular paper was just wonderful. And the fact that you make your data easily available for everyone to play with and use, I think that's wonderful and exactly the right ethic to have. And I just think that sometimes we get lazy in the ways in which we look at the world and the ways in which we try to understand the world. And what I find profoundly exciting about the last 20-25 years is that thanks to technology and the internet, we have all kinds of new data which reveals our society to us. We can get all kinds of new insights from this, not just about the present, but as we'll discuss today, about the past. And that excites me tremendously. We can move past all the regular measures, all the regular metrics, and we can go one level deeper, two levels deeper, three levels deeper. And that's what we are going to attempt to do. If this episode isn't enough, because we have so much to talk about, we'll do one more at some point after this, getting deeper into the relations between men and women, and how society is changing in all kinds of unexpected and counterintuitive ways. So we'll get to that. And yeah, so I'm filled with excitement. In this episode, we have a bunch of interesting chapters coming up, which are really not about, data seems like a boring word. They're about new ways of looking at the world and about understanding ourselves. And that's a big deal. So Ajay, I want to begin with a story of a very inspiring man, Luca Cavalli Sforza, who was a researcher born in the early part of the last century, I think circa 1918 or so, and a very solid scientist whose deep interest was in the deep past. And in those days, the early 20th century, the only way you could really understand the deep past was through examining dead things like fossils or looking at ruins. The stuff of archaeology, carbon dating was coming about, which is great. But they were all things that had been around for hundreds and thousands of years, and then you had to figure out what to do with them. And you could get scanned data from them. And yet, whatever theories came up in academia about the deep past, about our prehistory, took on a form of conventional wisdom that then remained and then that constrained inquiry. Luca Cavalli Sforza was someone who was deeply interested in new ways of learning about the past. Like, in his early days, he worked, for example, with blood groups, trying to understand what the past would look like by examining the blood groups of different populations and so on and so forth. And in the early 1960s, he took a bet, which, if you think about it now, seems wild. It seems insane. And his bet was that we shall find out about human history, about humanity, about how we came to be through genetic trails, through studying the genes of human beings. Now, this is a number of decades before the human genome was processed. The human genome was processed completely for the first time in 2001. DNA sequencing started getting mature in the 80s and later in the 90s. It was in the 1980s that scientists examined mitochondrial DNA, which is a small part of the genome, and which really looks at your mother's ancestry. And through that, we managed to figure out that, okay, we all came from Africa. In particular, there was one hardy woman in Africa who is, in the literature known as mitochondrial Eve, and we all descended from there. And this was dramatic at the time, but things really got more dramatic around the turn of the century, once the science got to where Luca Cavalli Sforza's vision had been all along. That if we sequence a full genome, which would have seemed impossible in the 60s at the time he conceived of it, then all of human history, not just the current moment, not just the body as it is now, but all of human history is open to us, and that started happening in the 2000s. So by 2009, this was a full-fledged science where you're doing full genome studies and you're looking into the past with them. Now, in the past, you could have looked at your male ancestors by studying the Y chromosome, or you could have looked at your female bloodlines by studying mitochondrial DNA. But this was just a whole step. You could go through, you could travel every path back into the past. And I won't go in much detail into the science of this, except to say that there are two books that everyone should read, which talk about the science of this in detail, and which also have this amazing bunch of findings, which honestly I haven't stopped thinking about since I read those books many years ago. One of them is a book called Who We Are and How We Got Here by David Reich. And the other one is a great book by Tony Joseph called Early Indians. I have an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with Tony Joseph, and its findings are just stunning, and I'll talk about them in some detail as we go along. And you should read these two books. They'll give you a detailed explanation of why, what the exact science is and why this genetic data is so powerful in revealing ancient times and what really went on. Now, I want to begin before we get to India, before we get to our society, because that is the insights on our society are really what have blown my mind. Before I get to that, I want to talk about some of the broad findings from this. And I want to point one thing out, that now it is accepted that what we have learnt by studying the human genome invalidates a lot of the received conventional wisdom from archaeology and all our prior studies of history before this. That a lot of what we knew was essentially wrong, and a lot of the science has really happened in the last decade and a half, which is why it's so profoundly exciting. I sometimes look back on the 19th century and I think of medicine in the 19th century. It was so primitive. Bloodletting was a common cure for many things. The germ theory of disease did not exist. Gregor Mendel hadn't yet come about, of course. So there was so much about the human body that was a mystery, and more people actually died of going to a hospital than if they just stayed at home, they would be fine. Which is why, quack forms of treatment like homeopathy became so prominent because the alternatives weren't very much better. And we look at how science has advanced today, and we look at science today and we think abhi to state of the art hai, it can hardly get better. What we know now is definitely the truth, and we'll make incremental advances. And I continue warning people at every step that don't look at the world like that. Don't think that where we have reached is the pinnacle of knowledge. 2 centuries later, we will look back on the people of 2025 and think those poor sods knew nothing. What we know today is the equivalent of that bloodletting which we make fun of from 2 centuries ago, from 1825. So, and one of those big quantum leaps in knowledge has really happened because of sequencing the genome and using it to understand not just we as we are now, but how we got here, who we are and how we got here, the title of Reich's book. And I found that profoundly exciting. So the key finding of this new science is that we are more mixed up than we thought. Right? Earlier, there used to be an assumption that fine, we came out of Africa, but then a bunch of people went and settled in Europe, and a bunch of people went and settled somewhere else, and they were more or less separate populations from there, and people draw all kinds of racial assumptions about the differences between people, and etc. etc. And what we have now learned is that that's not quite the whole story. That yeah, we came out of Africa, we came out of this fine lady, Namaste Mate, mitochondrial Eve, and we, we all came out of this fine lady, all 7.5 billion of us. And why are you laughing? This is a serious subject. But I suspect the lady would also laugh if she knew what she had wrought. Uh, all for a few moments of pleasure, right? So anyway, so we come from there, and after that there have been massive intermixtures. Like I sometimes think, and I've got to search, and while refreshing my memory for this episode, I haven't actually done a search, but if we find something like that, we'll show it on the screen, but I doubt it. Someone should make it a time-lapse video of human beings and their movements across continents over 100,000 years. Right, so 65,000 years the migrations from Africa happened, but since then there has been a constant intermingling. In Europe, for example, there have been 5 massive migrations. 3 of them from different hunter-gatherers, peoples from all over the place, and 2 from largely agricultural society. The 5th of them coming from the Central Steppes, and in a sense, we come from there also because that is where the whole Indo-European languages, and that is where that sort of line comes from. And there is a mad khichdi happening all over Europe. Similarly, in India, there were 4 major migrations, and I will get to that in a moment. Latin America, I think, is around 4 major migrations from all over the place, and people are intermixing wildly, not just among Homo sapiens, but beyond it. For example, 3 to 5% of the genes of people in Asia, of people in Europe and large parts of Asia, actually come from Neanderthals. That we were having a party with Neanderthals about 50 to 60,000 years ago, and there's Neanderthal genes happening there as well. So when people they'll often use Neanderthal as a pejorative. Arey, he's a Neanderthal, what will he understand of art? But actually that's part of who we are, and there's nothing wrong or right in that. So there is this massive khichdi, this massive melting pot. We are all mixed up. We've seen this with languages. It is much more visible how this is the case with languages, but it is also the case with peoples, which is why that yes, there are huge differences that you perceive along these different populations, but they all get mixed up with each other, and we are all fundamentally one people. We are all a khichdi, and that's one delightful revelation. So let's talk about India now. India went through 4 major migrations. The first of them 65,000 years ago, out of Africa, as it were. And Tony refers to those people as the first Indians. And we all have genes from there. We all, you and I have also descended from there, from these first Indians. There's a greater proportion of their genes within tribal communities because there was less intermixture in future migrations with them. So it's very interesting. You get different percentages all around, but that's your first broad migration. 65,000 years ago they come, and for a long time they are effectively the only people in what we call the subcontinent, right? Then around 7,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE, there are agricultural nomads coming over from Central Asia, and they effectively form what we can think of today as the Indus Valley civilization, the Harappan civilization. They come to northwest India, they bring agriculture, there is wheat and barley happening there, and they are gradually settled in there, and that is who those people are. We still haven't deciphered their language, brave attempts are on, but there is good reason to believe that it was probably a Proto-Dravidian language, an early version of Tamil, which by the way is older than Sanskrit. Not many people know this. When I was in school, in fact, I thought all Indian languages come out of Sanskrit, but that's patently not true. So that's your second wave of migrations. You have further waves of migrations from Austroasiatic people and Tibetan Burman people in the northeast, and those are separate. Let's not go too much into these. But the other major migrations that happen around 1900 BCE or 2000 BCE, which is around 4000 years ago, which are the Indo-Europeans, and the Indo-Europeans are again coming from Central Asia, coming down from the steppes. They're bringing with them an early form of what later became Sanskrit. They're bringing with them an Indo-European language. Now, the thing is that once they come, Tony sort of divides what is happening in India into ancient North Indians and ancient South Indians. And the ancient South Indians are the people who came downwards from after the Indus Valley civilization happened. They're speaking some Proto-Dravidian languages, which are becoming the Dravidian languages. The ancient North Indians, ANI and ASI is how he refers to them, are the Indo-European migrants, as it were. And by now, there's been a complete mixture between the first Indians and the Harappans. So they are just mixed in there. In some places, in tribal societies and islands and Andamans and all that, they're still they're still there in a relatively unfiltered form, but otherwise they've sort of assimilated. And now the ancient North Indians and the ancient South Indians are having a party, right? So it's not that these are two separate peoples, and it is not that one people colonized the other people or took over the other people. It is not like that. There are very complex undercurrents of conquest and trade and intermingling and migration, and all of those are happening. And all of us, to some extent, have both these genes. We are descendants, just as we are descendants of the first Indians who came out of Africa. We are also descendants of the Harappans. We are also descendants of the Indo-Aryans, to differing degrees. I am likely to have more ANI genes than, say, my friend who might have been born and brought up in Chennai, who's a Tamilian, who would have more ASI genes. But he will also have ANI, and I will also have ASI, and there's a huge khichdi going on there. And this is a profound khichdi, and this is unfortunately also a political talking point, because there was an early theory long ago that there was an Aryan invasion. Then there was a school of thought that said that no, there was no invasion. The Aryans were the original people, and everything came out of here, right? Which is patent nonsense, and the data shows it. And not just genetic data, but other data also that I'll come to in a moment. What really happened, the way modern scientists would like to talk of it, is that there was an Aryan migration, right? It wasn't an invasion, we don't know that. There was an Aryan migration. As tends to happen, a lot of this migration happened with mainly male travelers coming into the land. Now I'll draw you to another great book, Wanderers, Kings and Merchants by Peggy Mohan, where she uses language to do exactly what Joseph and Reich did with genetics, where she looks back into language and does that kind of forensic work, and then begins to figure out, okay, how did all the languages get formed? How did they evolve? And what does this tell us about our history? And one of the big TILs in that book for me is that Sanskrit, even if it came out of the Indo-European languages, is not a pure Indo-European language, because Sanskrit has certain elements which are not there in the Indo-European languages just before it, like Persian, for example. In particular, it has retroflex sounds. What is a retroflex sound, Ajay Shah? So when your tongue hits the back of your teeth, you make a particular sound, which is a retroflex sound. For example, I'll give you two Hindi words, I want you to say them. Tal.
Tal.
Tal. That's a normal word, or it's not a retroflex word. Now, tal.
Michael, Tal.
Tal. So, your tongue touched the back of your teeth. Gentle readers, try it. Now, what did your tongue touch? It touched your dant. Say dant.
Dant.
Right. And actually, the irony is that while you said dant, your tongue didn't touch your dant. But if I scold you now, I will be giving you a dant. Say dant.
Dant.
Dant. Dant.
Dant.
Right? Your tongue is touching the roof of the... And That does not happen in the Indo-European languages immediately, to the west of Asia where we came from. It's not there in Persian, it's not there in any of those bridge languages. But it is there in the Dravidian languages. It is there in the languages that the Aryans encountered when they came here. So what they came here with was a kind of Proto-Sanskrit. And the Sanskrit that then evolved, that is part of the Vedas, is again a delightful khichris. And khichris are like awesome. They are the stuff of life. Is a delightful khichri of that original Indo-European linguistic tradition they brought with them and the local languages that they heard from there. So you have this situation where over 1,000, over 1,500 years, Sanskrit is evolving, the Vedas are written. Then at one point, there is this movement to ossify Sanskrit, to make it the language of learning and the language of a certain class and caste and whatever. And therefore, that's where Sanskrit begins its journey to becoming a dead language, much as what happened with Latin and Greek. And instead, it is Prakrit that is constantly evolving and taking from local tongues. Now, one of the interesting things that I learned from Peggy Mohan's book, and this again just blew my mind, it's really worth thinking about because we see echoes of it to the current day, is that the men who came spoke a particular language, but the women they married were the local women. Whether by force or consensually or whatever, we don't know all that. We don't need to get into all that. But the women they married were local women because the men came alone. Right. And by the way, one little bit of trivia, more of that ancestral ANI gene survives in the ASI genes. So the people who came, whether migrants or invaders or whatever, they were more successful in actually spreading their genes and getting action, as it were. But regardless, the male migrants are marrying local women and they're speaking different languages. So what would typically happen with a young boy is that the young boy will, spend the first 2-3 years of his life with his mom, as will the girls. But the paths will diverge after early childhood. And then once early child, and they will speak the mother's language. And once early childhood is over, the boy will go out doing his apprenticeship, going hunting, going gathering, going whatever it is men of that period do. And he will learn to speak the men's language. So it's really interesting that the women stay home, they stay in the kitchen, they learn a particular kind of language and everything that a language brings with it. And the boys, they start with that, but they go on to learn the men's languages. And I often say that you should not think of a language as just a means of communication. A language encodes much else within it, right? And I often wonder about this. I have no definitive answers. I've spoken about this with many translators and writers, that if you look at, say, languages like Japanese and Korean, I love them for their minimalism. They lend themselves to an economy of expression, to a terseness and a conciseness and a pithiness, right? And I love that. Equally, there are other languages like, like Urdu, like Punjabi, like Bengali, which are expressionistic, right? Which are exuberant and delightful. And English is kind of a utilitarian language somewhere in the middle of this, which is why if you translate Tagore directly from Bengali to English, like he himself tried sometimes, it doesn't sound that great because the values of the two languages are different. Because English is saying that don't shout too loudly, be easy, don't get too poetic. Whereas that kind of poetry has an entirely different flavor in Bengali, in Urdu. And then you begin to wonder that different languages will encourage different kinds of thinking, perhaps different ways of feeling. Wittgenstein once said that it is impossible to contribute all of the world because we are limited by language, right? And we are particularly limited by the languages that we know because there are only sort of so many. So this is sort of an interesting aside about language, about what is happening there. And this is one of those revelations that we are a mad khichri. Our language is a result of this. But that great intermixing, the great party in the subcontinent, as I call it, only happens for a couple of thousand years. Like around 1900, the Harappans kind of get affected from where they are. We don't know why the Indus Valley civilization kind of went down around 1900 BCE, but they come downwards and to South India and so on. Then the Aryans come. Then for about 2000 years, till 100 Common Era, till 100 CE, they are basically partying. There is full intermingling. That is a genetic evidence. There is no sense of, oh, these are our people, these are not our people. There's no sense of caste. What happens around 100 CE is critical because what happens then is that a particular ideological strand in the Gangetic belt wins out and you have severe caste endogamy begin. And the evidence of this caste endogamy is in the genetic lines. Like David Reich has a beautiful line in his book where he says that if you're looking for a large population, look at the Han Chinese. They're a large population. India is many thousands of small populations. So you have these reproductive barriers set up, and people are only marrying within their caste and procreating within their caste. And interestingly, upper caste men are more successful at spreading their genes than lower caste men, which is, also interesting and tells you something deeply disturbing about our society. But there is this caste endogamy that goes on for a long time. And along with this caste endogamy comes the treatment of women, because one of the natural consequences of caste endogamy is that you want to control female sexuality. You don't want females to go around having affairs or have babies with people from other places or, God forbid, fall in love. And therefore, there is a much sharper control on female sexuality, and therefore, there is much more sexual repression within society, all of which has an effect to the current day. Right, a lot of the prudish morality of the current day is partly brought by the British. It's a Victorian morality of the 1800s, and we weren't really like that. And part of it comes about because of endogamy. Now, this plays into the debates around caste as well. There are different schools of thought on caste, and all of them contain a grain of truth. One school of thought says that, look, when the British came here, what they entered a society which they could not possibly have grokked because it was deeply complex. We did an episode on Hinduism earlier, which looked at Manu Pillai's excellent book, where he has this great introductory chapter called A Brief History of Hinduism. That for those 2000 years where caste endogamy is happening, but at the same time, Hinduism itself isn't Hinduism, right? That word isn't exactly applied to it. There are lots of different beliefs. There are Vaishnavites, there are Shaivites, there are sects, there are cults. And it's almost like an open source religion, that every local practice is being drawn into the rubric of Hinduism. That every time there is a new custom to be incorporated, it finds a place in the Puranas, and, I mean, an open source religion is exactly how I think of it. There's an assimilation, there is a melding, quite at odds with what is actually happening in the world of caste. So if you think about it, caste and religion have slightly different paths, and caste is far more constricting at that time. Then the British arrive here in the 19th century, and here I'm stating one theory. This is, I don't know enough to have an opinion on it either way, but I see many grains of truth in this. Right? The British come here, and their early interlocutors are the elites. See, elites happen to be Brahmins who have a particular Brahman vision which comes from the Vedas, and which comes from the Manusmriti, where they think of the four Varnas. And so that's the narrative that they sell the British, that this is it, this is our caste system, this is whatever. And now we come back to the subject of measurement, that the British are trying to grok the country. They want to measure it, they need categories, they make those categories. Those categories include religions, those categories include castes. And the thing is, when you force someone to write down their identity in under a particular category, there's a feeling of ossification that is going on. You might feel I contain multitudes, but being by force to tick one box, it has an effect on how you see yourself as well. I did a recent episode of The Seen and the Unseen with Ghazala Wahab on her book The Hindi Heartland. I don't know if this episode will be out before this or after this, but regardless, there she has this great excerpt about how this exact thing happened in India, in the Hindi heartland, where a lot of tribals were in fact made to tick a box called Hinduism. And now there is a massive mass movement against it, where these people are asserting their prior identities and saying, no, we don't see ourselves necessarily like that. They're again asserting their multitudes. We've had debates about what the caste census could do. I have a Seen and the Unseen episode on it. So I'm just summarizing this point of view. This point of view is that these categories were fluid, that the British created this by, or the British exacerbated it by putting it down on paper, and then once people had to choose, it got ossified, and the British sold that narrative to the people, and in an act of reflexivity, society changing from the way you see society. Right, it's a term I first learned from George Soros in his book, The Mystery of Finance. But where did I say that? But I heard it in the context of finance. But in an act of reflexivity, the narratives that you impose on society changes how society sees itself, and caste becomes ossified. Now you will realize that these two narratives are run counter to each other. One narrative says that caste consciousness is relatively a British imposition and it was hurt by categorization. But today the genetic data tells us that caste endogamy is real in India. It is vile and it is toxic and it's been around for 2000 years and you can't ignore it and you can't put a spin on it. It is absolutely there. And I think that there is truth to both sides of it. That, classification, ossification, thinking in terms of caste, making that, a big beacon of your identity rather than embracing multitudes does have, a bad effect. But at the same time, caste was real. And this is both a sad story and a happy story. It's a sad story because caste is deeply embedded in Indian society and there is no magic bullet. We think of things like urbanization and markets, which will kind of solve it. The reforms of 1991 brought hundreds of millions of Dalits out of poverty, which is something not often noted. I would argue Manmohan Singh did more for Dalits than any other thinker of the 20th century. Though, of course, I also, as you know, recognize Ambedkar's greatness and all of that. All these people played a part. That's why the Dalit activist Chandrabhan Prasad, when he came on my show, he said his two heroes are Ambedkar and Adam Smith. But despite that, markets, urbanization may start ameliorating the problem, but they're not magic bullets. It's a very, very deep problem. That's a sad story. The happy story is this. The happy story is that this is a recent story. I once, many years ago, I remember I referred to caste as the original sin of Hinduism. I think it's the deepest sin of Hinduism, but it's not the original sin because it wasn't so bad till 100 CE, right? It's 2000 years old. Whereas if you look at this subcontinent from the time the Aryans come to that great melding which is happening, that's 4000 years ago, right? It wasn't always like this. It so happens that one ideological strain worked out, we went down that direction, but we didn't have to go down that direction. We can reverse it. We can choose our own paths. And that is, good for me to know. So I think it is important for us to recognize that this is the way Indian society is, but it also gives me hope that it's really fairly recent in the long scheme of things, and therefore we can do something about it. And finally, before I turn to you for your thoughts, I think one important caveat to make here is that both Raik and Tony are at pains to point out that, none of these differences that still exist, like the differences are fewer than we earlier thought because of all the intermixture that is happening, but none of these differences that exist should become a reason for stereotypical racist thinking or stereotypical racial thinking. I think differences are amazing. Differences should be celebrated. We are different in all kinds of directions. We are far more alike than we are different, but the differences are not a problem. I think people often, when they look at human nature and they look at culture, they commit sometimes what G.E. Moore called the naturalistic fallacy. They assume that something that is natural is right. That if there is a difference between, say, men and women, it should be enshrined and it should always be thus. And that's a fallacy. We should not, derive the ought from the is, which brings me to David Hume's concept of the is-ought fallacy. Just because something is that way, that means it should be that way. So this is a point both Reich and Tony Joseph make, that there are differences. These differences are something to celebrate. They're bloody awesome. And all racism is fundamentally wrong. All the assumptions are fundamentally flawed. Different people are not superior to any other people. We are all essentially the same. We all came from mitochondrial Eve. So, we should celebrate that. And I just feel that, you need to go and read the books, because I don't think I can articulate the extent to which it is so illuminating and heartening for me to think about these findings and ponder over them.
What I want to underline is the extent to which new kinds of measurement have decisively settled a debate. It's no longer an opinion. It's no longer messy, careful archaeology looking at one kind of tool after another, which was the old ways. We brought guns to a knife fight and we settled these questions. And that's the link to the glories of measurement. On the specific story that you told, here are some thoughts that came up to my mind, and I just love to have your responses. I thought of the British trying to undertake a state legibility project, right? So if there is an alternative title for the book, Seeing Like a State, the title would be that state legibility projects have unintended consequences. And this would be one more of those, that the state tried to make caste legible, and in the process, it changed the caste system. So that's like an interesting thing. And also, like, it's a Heisenberg effect, that by shining a light on the phenomenon, you change the phenomenon. So it's very interesting watching this happen. And if you hadn't done that, then maybe there would have been a different system that would be purring along in its own admittedly deeply broken endogamous logic. Okay, my next thought is on endogamy. I don't know the science of it, but are all jatis in India big enough to be larger than a minimum viable population, or does endogamy lead to a damage in the quality of the gene pool for smaller jatis? And if so, it has very big public health consequences, that the emergence of modernity is just going to make healthier people, and that's going to be a interesting gain that will come in India. So I'm just curious, that could it be that some jatis are big enough and you do endogamy between that and you're fine? But are there small jatis where we have encountered these kinds of problems? And finally, I was just remembering when I have traveled in Mauritius and in Sri Lanka, this has been a recurring theme that you see in islands and on shores, on coastlines, that you always get a more heterogeneous DNA because there have been sailors, travelers, visitors for millennia. So, in that sense, there is a gene flow that is happening all along the coast of India. You will see an interesting level of genetic diversity where there are a variety of people who are breaking with the endogamous procedures that are more prevalent inside the mainland. So, I wonder whether this kind of thing has been measured in India.
That's a fantastic point, because I think diversity is always and everywhere good in all contexts. It is never not the case. Like, something that we have often bemoaned is about how homogenization in various different contexts is incredibly harmful. Like, I'm just coming off reading James C. Scott's book In Praise of Floods, where he talks about the diversity that existed before the agricultural age, and then you have the agricultural age, and ultimately out of, I think, 200,000 varieties of plant, there are only 12 which are a major part of our food chain today, wheat and barley being among them, which the Harappans kind of got. And equally, out of all the 60,000 kind of animals, there are only 4 species which proliferate and dominate the landscape, because they are the ones that we bred in a sense and we eat, which is goats, sheep, pigs, and cows. Right? And equally, when it comes to birds, there is just chickens. Do you know, Ajay Shah, that for every human being on this planet, there are 3 chickens, right? And they're all being industrially farmed right now. And this kind of homogenization is terrible, right? And gentle reader, read Against the Grain by James C. Scott, his earlier book, to see the havoc that the agricultural age brought to humankind. In Praise of Floods is also a pretty good book. I have some misgivings. Parts of it are a masterpiece, but you should read everything by James C. Scott. We'll talk more about both those books in detail later. But yeah, and therefore, when diversity happens, I feel absolutely freaking delighted. Like, earlier, on this show, On the Seen and the Unseen, I've chatted at length about how we would worry about what you eloquently call the great flattening sound when it comes to language. That a language is a dialect with an army, that everywhere you saw beautiful dialects, I would call them languages in their own right, like Bhojpuri, Maithili, Haryanvi, and so on, disappearing and being taken over under the hegemonic sway of languages like Hindi and Bengali and Tamil, and the dialects kind of disappear. And what we have had in modern times is a reversal of that process. Like, the first impulse of markets was you go for scale and you homogenize, but the second empowering effect of markets is that you empower individuals to find the long tail and to go off in their different directions. So my friend Vinay Singhal runs a site called Stage.in, which is like a Netflix for Bharat. And it has content not in the Indian languages, but in the Indian dialects like Haryanvi and Bhojpuri. And they charge Netflix prices. And when I spoke to him 4 years ago, they had like 4 lakh subscribers. It must be much more by now. I even tried to invest, but I somehow dropped the thread, because I really believe in that project and I believe in that guy. And the thing is that I wonder, that can we reverse those processes, and can we get to a stage where, yes, there's been a lot of homogenization in a lot of different ways, but can we get to diversity again? And when it comes to our society, I believe we can.
Okay, Amit, we have done a chunk of knowledge around the ability to read DNA and how it has profoundly changed our view of the world. Take us on the next step of that story.
Let me take you on the next step to that story. The first step of the story was based on something that is always with us, our genes, right? So is the second step. Guess what? Our phones. I have never seen you without your smartphone, Ajay Shah. Always you are sending messages on your smartphone. In fact, Namsita and Vaishnav and I often wonder, what are you doing? And you always say while you blush, I am checking the weather. I'm not so sure about that, but nevertheless, let us continue. It's amazing how much data is really hidden in our smartphones and what they reveal about the person. Now, at a later point in time, I will talk about what our searches reveal and what our patterns of using the apps that we use, what they reveal. I'm not even talking about that right now. Right now, I'm talking about simple things like what is a battery life on your phone. There's a Chinese company called Smart Finance. So what Smart Finance does is they give microloans and loans very fast. And what they do is they ask for access to your phone data. And from your phone data, they figure out if you're credit worthy or not by using a whole bunch of metrics. And possibly a lot of AI involved here. And one of those metrics is the battery charge on your phone. And one of the things they have found is that if your battery on your phone goes below 12% regularly, they will not give you a loan. They won't consider you credit worthy. So, but if it's much higher and you keep it maintained at a good level, then you're considered more credit worthy. It can't go to the other extreme. There's another lending company called Lendo. I think it's a Japanese company. And Lendo tracked the same metric, and they found that if your phone is charged all the time, you're not credit worthy, because they'll be like, you're too robotic or you play it too safe or whatever, but they've decided those guys are not credit worthy. So there is some optimal sweet point where and I always try to keep my phone around 80% or something, so I guess I'm in that sweet spot. But there is some optimal sweet point where they look at your credit worthiness. What Smart Finance also does is they look at a whole bunch of other metrics. For example, if you are filling out your date of birth, how fast do you do it? They'll measure that, and that speed will tell them something. And how it works is, it is not as if that they have a prior belief that people with low battery life are not credit worthy. Instead, they have data from millions of phones and they accumulate that. And according to that, they're just comparing data across all of the phones. And therefore, their algo itself will come to an understanding that low battery life isn't good. If somebody fills in their birth date too fast, that's not good. If somebody makes a typo and then goes back to correct it, that's not good. All of these are genuine findings from Smart Finance. So I find it really interesting. Now, you could, of course, argue that there are privacy issues here. How much data do you want to give away? But the point here is, Smart Finance is basically telling you that, look, if you want a loan from me, give me these permissions. So it's a quid pro quo. And then if you give those permissions, then it's up to the data. And the thing is, in some cases, like you would have heard of the battery life cases, so you'll make sure ki loan chahiye and you'll keep it charged. But you won't know, I mean, there are thousands of metrics apparently. And many of them would not even be known to Smart Finance itself, because machine learning is like a black box, right? You don't know why you come to the conclusions you come to, but you come to them. The same way, a lot of the things that AlphaZero did while playing chess, we had to then reverse engineer and try and figure out that why is it playing this way, that, we sort of valued material more than initiative, or this was a right balance according to us, and now we know this is not the right balance. Initiative matters a little bit more than we thought, and the weightage is different, and you figure that out, but the machine itself isn't telling you that. So to me, that's really interesting, because if we know metrics, we can game metrics, but we don't even know what the metrics are. And then how do we gain them? There's another company with Tala which operates in Africa and Asia, and they do a similar thing. They look at, for example, how often you recharge your phone. So if you're doing frequent small recharges, your credit worthiness will be lower than if you do a huge recharge once in a while, because you're considered more impulsive or whatever. All the whys are something, by the way, humans will have to figure out. The machine is not concerned with the whys. It is just looking at the patterns and going by the patterns that frequent recharges mean relatively unreliable, and it is assigning weightages to that. It will look at your contact list. It will look at your contact list and see how many people you know, which matters, and how many people you know who in the past have repaid a Tala loan. Because if you know people who've repaid their loans, it is assumed that you are in relatively good circles. I'm sure it is also looking at the frequency of how often you contact which people and what their scores are like. So it's almost like what China is doing in a very creepy way with the social credit score, which is an invasion of privacy, and they're being very creepy about it. But here is this company
But
saying,
that's by the government. That's such a different
exactly,
level.
that's by the government, and this is voluntary. This is a company telling you, give me access to your phone. If I like what I see, I'll give
Correct.
you a loan, and
Correct.
you have nothing to lose by doing that. So this is a really innovative way. Now, there's a 2018 study we'll also link to in the show notes, which looked at Germany and which found a number of interesting things. And one of them won't surprise you. One of them is that a person who is using the Apple operating system, who is using an iPhone, is more likely to repay a loan than a person using an Android. I think the Android default rate is something like 1.7, the Apple is 1.07, something like that. So it's a significant difference. I, of course, use an Android. What do you use, Ajay Shah? You use an Android, but we are both. And, I want to sort of bring in a sideline here. 25 years ago, I had a Standard Chartered credit card, right? And what would typically happen is I would have an outstanding, but I hadn't set up automatic payment. And because I'm Bengali, I'd be lazy. So somebody would call me and then I'd say, okay, send someone to my office and I'll make the payment. I used to work in a job then. This is quick info. And so I relied on the call coming to me and then I would make the payment and I wasn't spending much. So once apparently the amount was so piddly, 80 rupees, that they didn't call me. And I never knew that something is outstanding. And then the card was unvalidated, devalidated, taken away. My Chrysler credit score went to hell. And those people would then keep calling me and say, oh, that 80 rupees with interest has now gone to 3,000. It has now gone to 5,000. And at first I was like, no, send me the bill. I want to see the bill. And they would not send me the bill. Eventually it went to 29,000. And I refused on a matter of principle to pay it. I could just pay it off. But I refused on a matter of principle to pay it. And I said, I will never pay this off because this is just freaking wrong, that this is manipulative. And these really abusive calling agents would call. You know how credit card companies in India operate. So these gundas would call and they would make threats. And I figured out a way to get past that. Today, thankfully, I have a credit card because, and this is a typical Indian story, a friend of mine runs a bank. तो उसने दे दिया. So I'm properly premium now and all that, even though my credit score is still shit. And yet I fancy that if you could see all the other data about me, you would realize that I'm an absolutely upstanding citizen. I hate having freaking owing anybody money. I have never had EMI arrangements with anyone. When all our vendors do work for us, they get paid immediately. They get paid in advance if they want. I am that kind of person. And yet, if you just look at my Chrysler credit rating, it's down there somewhere. So, all these new ways of looking at data, I think, help you build a more holistic picture of a person. And other metrics that come in, the same German study found that another, I think they had 10 indicators, another of the indicators of credit worthiness is email address. If you have a Hotmail email address or a Yahoo email address, you're less reliable than someone who has a more modern email provider or have their own IP-based thing set up. They found that if you have a typo in your email, they write to you and you get that mailer demon bounce back, you are the kind of careless person who is less likely to repay a loan anyway. So that actually works against you. So similarly, you have this bunch of metrics that if somebody buys something at 2 a.m., if they're always shopping at 2 a.m., their credit worthiness is suspect because they're likely to be impulsive people. So daytime purchases get a better weightage in terms of credit worthiness. So I just found all of this really fascinating in terms of just looking at these patterns of behavior and not deducing anything from the pattern in an intellectual way that he did this, therefore he is that, but instead just looking at the data from millions of users and then leaving the intellectualizing to us later on, but finding patterns that are reliable.
So a sweet phrase has emerged in this field, which is digital exhaust. So the idea is that we are leading our normal life, we are reading and writing email, we are buying vada pav, and as a side effect of our normal life and activities, there is this digital exhaust of information that you might otherwise consider to be just trash. But actually, there are people opening that garbage bin and finding all this information and trying to use it. And it's fascinating and interesting and powerful. I do want to underline what you said about the privacy question, that we do need privacy frameworks around the use of this information, around the transfer of this information from one firm to another. But these are all qualitatively easier problems compared with the problem of privacy vis-a-vis the government. Okay, so in India, we've got it all upside down. The government has unlimited access to personal information, and the government sets out to prevent private firms from having access to personal information. And this whole thing is just topsy-turvy. If there is a need for protection, it is against the state. The second stuff, it's like there's very little harm that Google can do to you. So yeah, we need privacy frameworks to deal with the information that Google has about us. But the first primordial requirement is to shut off the ability of the government to see each person.
Because that's where the coercion is.
Yes.
While we are on phones, another interesting use of this data actually happened after COVID, where people mapped location data, including in India, to first figure out what are the movements that are happening. Like we know that if you look at the data, you know that the lockdown largely worked, people stayed at home, except for the migrant labor problem. And, you could actually track it through looking at location data. And then location data was useful in two other ways. One, you could see when a recovery began. A recovery did not begin when the government said it's good to go out or whatever. The second wave was devastating, and everyone lost someone during that time. So the recovery didn't begin immediately because people were still wary. The recovery took time to begin, but the thing is the data was there to be able to track that recovery, understand when it is happening, and the flip side of that, understanding that surges are now likely. Because if people are gathering for Diwali or movement has increased because of a festival, you know that, okay, there might be another outbreak of COVID and surges are likely, and you could use it in interesting ways. You could, for example, use it in the financial markets by knowing that sales of a particular drug will go up around this time, or sales of masks will go up, or etc., etc. But all the data was, out there.
So Google and Facebook had released mobility measures for all over the country, and it was just like a gorgeous public domain data release that they did that helped everybody to understand the pandemic better. Okay, Amit, carry us further into amazing new kinds of information and how we can see the world in new ways.
So I want to tell you a story. In 2009, there's a gentleman named Tom Diamond. Tom Diamond goes to meet his brother Alex Diamond somewhere, and Alex Diamond happens to work in a firm that gets satellite data. They get satellite imagery for, of various kinds. And I forget the exact details, but there is apparently some client who wants to know whether, they're supposed to buy a factory in a particular place in some other country, and is the factory representing itself correctly in terms of the inventory and in terms of the traffic and whatever happens there. And Alex Diamond actually goes in for his firm and uses satellite imagery to show that, yeah, everything is as they have represented it. It's kosher. You can go ahead with the sale. Those guys are really impressed. And then Alex and Tom are sitting around later playing the guitar, because one of their passions is to do rock versions of Western classical music. And I tried to look for them on YouTube. I couldn't find them, but if I do, I'll link them from the show notes. They are known for a particular version of one of Schubert's compositions. So they are no doubt doodling around with the instruments, trying to do rock versions of Western classical. When an idea comes on them that we have a lot of this data, what else could it be good for? And one of them remembers something that Sam Walton once said. Sam Walton, who founded Walmart, once said that he would get a sense of how well the business is doing by seeing how many cars are parked in the parking lot outside that particular Walmart he was looking at. And that would give him a sense, are we doing well? Are we doing badly? Is this going to be a good quarter? And the Diamond Brothers asked themselves that what if we could get this data for all stores, not just for Walmart, but other retailers? And what kind of insight would this give us? So as a trial, Alex quit his company, but he bought from them 3 years of such satellite data, and they decided to backtest it. So they backtested it by looking at parking lots of places like Walmart and seeing, okay, what is the traffic there? And do surges in traffic indicate rising sales for the next quarter? And because every quarter report is really a report of something that happened in the past with a lag. But what if you could find it out in real time, get a sense of it in real time? So, and they found stark correlations that, yeah, when traffic surges, you can tell in advance that the quarter reports are going to be good. And when traffic goes down, you can tell in advance that the quarter reports are going to be bad. And then you can use this information in the financial markets to your advantage. So then they set up this firm called RS Metrics, RS for remote sensing. They set up this firm called RS Metrics. UBS then got in touch with them and said, let's work with the Walmart data. At this part of the story, some time after this part of the story comes in our good friend and your nephew, I think, Hemen Sampath, who I had a long chat on the phone with today morning, because after I told you I'm going to talk about Walmart, you said, hey, Hemen was part of that. And Hemen was indeed part of that. He was a late part of that. He came in sometime later in the story. The initial technology wasn't great. They would get like 12 pictures a month. That's it, 12 photographs a month, and it was expensive. And then, just as in the nighttime light story that you spoke about, the data became much cheaper and much more plentiful and much more granular, and you could get a lot of data that way. And essentially, Walmart used that, the people in the finance world used that data, and they found out that, my God, there is a heck of a correlation. And then this became common. This also sort of pioneered a field called alt data, alternative data. And there is one particular firm, I think, which once said that they had 1,000 vendors of alt data. Right? They were taking all data from 1,000 firms. So it's no longer a niche boutique kind of thing. RS Metrics, in fact, at one point, they were asked about production at a Tesla plant, and they chose to fly their own plane overhead and take pictures from below. Right? A few years ago, there was an accident where a train with 268 bogies, if I remember correctly, of iron ore capsized, had an accident and capsized in a particular place. And immediately, obviously, stock prices crashed and the prices for iron ore went up, and the market adjusted as it will to the assumed loss. But there were smart people who looked at satellite data, and they found that the iron ore was actually just lying flat, and it would be easy to reload it again. And therefore, the market is going to recover faster than most people think. And they made a killing on that. Equally, to show the how powerful this data is, and the next stat that I give you is going to blow your mind. As I say in all the clickbait, you won't believe what happened next. A couple of University of Berkeley professors actually took that Walmart data. They in fact took data from 67,000 stores across a whole bunch of retailers, and they looked at that data, and it's all parking lot data. And they said that if we had this data in advance, what advantage would we get in the market in terms of buying early or short selling? And they found that they would have a 4.7% edge over the common investor. Now, 4.7%, right? We would die for a 0.2% edge over the standard investor, because you're making the big bucks here. 4.7% is mind blowing. It is out of this world. And initially there were criticisms that, oh, this is only possible for people who can buy expensive satellite data, etc., etc. But the point is, all of this eventually equalizes. All of the data eventually becomes much more widely available and cheaper and all of that. And if you don't have that data and someone else does, you should really factor it into your purchase decisions and be a little careful about that. So I think it is wonderful that people are finding such innovative ways to use data to figure out truths about the world. Now, this might seem that this is not an important truth about the world. This is basically finance bros who are, using it to make a killing on the stock market. But to me, it's a great example of how data like this, a satellite image of a parking lot, can actually tell you something about how a society is feeling, because it is real people going in there, buying real things. And it's quite a terrific story to me.
There's a revolution going on of this nature. Here's one quick story from my head. Imagine that there is a tank containing oil. Okay, now many of these tanks have a roof which sits on the top of the oil. So when the tank is half empty, the roof falls down to half the height of the tank. So what people started doing was that they started looking at the size of the shadow of the sunlight. So the sun is at a known place, and when the tank is completely full, there's no shadow. When the tank falls, you start seeing the shadow of the sun in the vertical view of the satellite, and based on this you can estimate how full the tank is. So this is a remote sensing way to know how full a tank is. And these are amazing innovations. I want to talk a bit about this concern that some people have about the unfairness that some people have better information than others. Okay, and I think that the point of finance is that we create incentives for a wide variety of very smart people to produce information and do forecasting. Okay, so some people will make better models, some people will make better information, some people will pay for better information. All this is the raw material out of which prices are made. So A good efficient market is one in which there are many, many such clever people who make a more efficient price. And that price is a public good. The financial market prices run the society. So the public good they induce is that you get a better functioning economy because those prices impound all that information. For the rest, the game of speculative trading on the financial markets is intended to be tough. Like, it's not a free lunch. Nobody asks you to play in financial speculation if you don't really feel very, very strong. It's purely voluntary. The people who choose to speculate are going in with the knowledge and judgment that there are very other smart people who are there on this market. So we should never get into this investor protection when we are discussing speculator protection. Okay, to speculate on markets is a choice. You make up your mind. If it's too hot, then leave the kitchen. The people should not speculate on markets. They should just buy and hold index funds, and then you're done. Then you are not taking a bet on the market. So I have absolutely no reservation with people building innovative methods, techniques, algorithms, data sources, which make money because in the process they're making the market more efficient. Okay, Amit, show us new ways to think about measurement.
I want to show you new ways. I want to talk about society. I want to talk about men and women. I want to talk about their deepest desires, how they converge, how they diverge, what happens there. But there is so much material there that we'll need one full massive episode to do it in. So that's coming at you next week. After we finish this, we'll do this. But I want a fun chapter. And in this fun chapter with which we will end this episode, and it's fun because I say so. If you're watching me so far, you're having fun. So in this fun chapter, we'll talk about indexes, which you told me the British call indices, but the Americans call indexes. But I just kind of think indexes is more sexy because we don't talk of the sisses, we talk of the sexes. So we will talk of indexes. And the first index I want to bring to your attention is the lipstick index. Have you heard of it? Okay, so why don't you make a guess? What could the lipstick index be?
Sales of lipstick.
But what do they indicate? Rising sales, falling sales, what do they indicate?
Tough times, buy more lipstick.
This is brilliant. I am so impressed with you. So here's the thing. The intuitive thinking is that when there are tough times, luxury spending goes down first. You stop buying luxury goods. So therefore, one way of thinking is that you'll spend less on beauty. A lipstick is like almost like a luxury product. From a man's point of view, it feels like that to me. So therefore, it will go down. But actually, what you said is correct. That and Leonard Lauder of Estee Lauder first pointed this out in 2001 in that reception when lipstick sales went up, and he coined this term the lipstick index. And what he postulated was that in tough times, people will stop buying $200 handbag, but they want to feel good about themselves, so they'll still buy $20 lipsticks. So their way of feeling good and feeling luxurious will be to go for the cheapest luxury possible, which is these beauty products and which are kind of easy to get. And therefore, it is correct that luxury spending will go down, but spending on beauty products will go up. And this was borne out by the lipstick index in 2001. This was borne out in 2008 after the financial crisis. This was borne out again in 2011 when the markets went down a bit. But there was an exception to the story. What was the exception, Ajay Shah, and why?
Do tell.
The exception was COVID. People are wearing masks, so they don't need lipstick. You understand what I'm saying? This is a profound point. My next index is a term that was coined by an economist. You would know of that economist. He loved low interest rates. His name is Alan Greenspan. Can you think of the index?
No, I don't know.
It's a male underwear index. Greenspan's point of view was that when tough times come, and underwear is something that you don't actually need to buy. So you could say that the amount of time between buying underwear is, pun not intended, stretched. And therefore you delay it as far as possible. India mein to till the elastic is falling off completely, and then eventually you buy an underwear only when you absolutely have to. One of my friends, I won't name him, but a good friend of ours, someone we respect deeply, older than both of us, once told me this. He used to travel through Europe and Soviet Union playing chess in the 1980s and so on and so forth. And he once told me that the hack there was that you're carrying limited underwear. So when your underwear gets dirty, you just wear it inside out. So every underwear is effectively like two underwear. I did not delve deep into the questions of what wearing the inside of the underwear outside on the second day does to the jean pant in question. Or the corduroy in question. He once traded his corduroys for sex in Russia. You know, but I think I've revealed who it is. But anyway, so this is an interesting story. So there is the male underwear.
Uh, Alan Greenspan would smile benignly upon this episode because he famously insisted that we have huge marginal gains for understanding the economy from better measurement and low marginal gains for understanding the economy from doing more theory. He was just very skeptical about the economic theory project. He said, look, just give me more measures, give me better measurement, we'll go far. So it was his sense of, the Kepler type question that basically give me better data, I will look at statistical regularities. There's a huge amount of work to be done there. So he was never a fan of these big push efforts to try to grow better economic theory.
So my next index, Ajay Shah, is an index that involves a data point that men have been staring at forever because women wear them. This is called the hemline index. You've obviously heard of the hemline index. So basic funda, gentle reader, is this idea came about in the 1920s, is that the hemline of the skirt indicates a buoyancy of the economy. So in the roaring 1920s, as it were, you had those flapper mini skirts, if you remember them, delightfully cute things. But then in the 30s, when the Great Depression struck, the skirt level got lower and lower, the hemline got lower and lower. Then again in the swinging 60s, and you are spiritually a child of the 60s, I feel sometimes, Ajay Shah, so you would know what I mean by this. But in the 60s, spirits went up, hemlines went up, you had mini skirts again, a glorious moment. But then, after the 1973 oil shock, see the result of bad economics. In 1973 oil shock, maxi skirts came into vogue, which is, utterly shocking for me. So the hemline index has been, a big factor. And I have a question for you, actually, a really serious question. One of the great insights I have gotten from you in the course of doing all the 100 and whatever episodes we have done is about fertility and how it depends so much on the mood of the nation, right? The point that you made, and you did your PhD thesis on fertility, in fact, but the very deep point you made at the end of our population episode is that when times are bad, like when you're going through authoritarian times or autocratic times and things aren't looking good, people tend to have less kids, fertility goes down, and vice versa. And I wonder if this could also be related to the hemline index, that you will feel less sexy, you will feel less exuberance, and therefore that affects how you dress.
Yeah. Hannah Arendt said authoritarians run out of people to oppress. That it is so basic that you want the good life, you want a good society, and then people will have more children. Whereas when the world is more messed up, people will have less children. A problem with this measure is it requires high quality population data. And that's really the privilege of the advanced economies. So to get good quality year to year measures of the number of births is the privilege of South Korea and Japan. And in poor countries, you really don't have good quality population measures. There are some recent claims that the population of China is way less than is claimed in the official data.
So I'll run through some more indexes. There is a tie index, serious index, and it's pretty obvious that when there are layoffs in an economy, less people need to wear ties to work, so less ties are sold. But equally, this could also indicate a greater work from home kind of trend that is happening. And then there is a diaper rash index. Have you heard of the diaper rash index? This is quite serious. So the diaper rash index came into being in circa 2008 after the financial crisis there, when two things happened simultaneously. The sales of diapers went down and the sales of ointment went up, ointment for diaper rash, because what happened is people started saving on unnecessary purchases by buying less diapers, which means their poor babies got more rashes and therefore the sale of ointment went up. Right? And I haven't actually read anywhere in the literature if one offset the other and if the initial decision was wrong to begin with. I believe it was. You simply have to get your babies all the diapers they need, which is a sentence I never thought I'll say. But having said that, so there is the diaper rash index. Another index which has come about recently, I think 2021, 2022, it was in vogue, is the stripper index, where somebody who worked at a strip club pointed out that custom had gone down, in the sense that there were less customers, that there were less high value customers coming in for their private lap dances and so on and so forth. And again, in her mind, the sign of the economy going down a little bit, among other things. So, that's another very interesting index. And finally, we can end this episode with what I think is a truly awesome index, and that's the Billion Prices Project, which was started by Roberto Rigobon and Alberto Cavallo. One of them, I believe you have met also. I'll ask you to elaborate on that. But their funda was this, and why it was called the Billion Prices Project, is that people are measuring an economy with a small amount of data, but we have access to a lot more. So why don't we use that? So they would collate large amounts of data from the internet and put it together into what they felt was, on what they postulated was a more reliable index. And a couple of things emerged out of this. Number one was a realization that online prices often correlate to offline prices more than some people had speculated they would. They are pretty close together, and you can make a correlation, and they are a very, very good proxy or replacement. And the other was that between 2007 and 2015, they looked at data in Argentina. And if I remember correctly, Argentina was saying in those days that inflation is about 7 to 9% or 10% or whatever. And these guys found that according to their data, it was 20 to 30% per year. That it was just shooting up, and the crisis was much worse than what people thought. And of course, eventually shit hit the fan, and we know that happened. And, more power to Javier Milei. And someday we'll do an episode on him, no doubt, once the dust settles. But, they went through that crisis. So, and I love that approach. We spoke earlier about the importance of diversity. I think the same thing comes to data. If you're building an index, the more diverse sources you use, the better it is, the more reliable it is. And then you can parse separate parts of it and figure out what those pieces mean.
Yeah. In my life in economics, I've always pushed on quiet, small triangulation projects where the idea is that there are multiple measures available of a certain phenomenon, and do they agree with each other? Okay, do they not agree? Which of them seem to make sense? So it's always interesting to devote time and effort on understanding the strengths and limitations of multiple alternative data sources. Sometimes it validates a certain measure, you get more confidence in using it and believing the results. See, all this is ultimately about updation of our priors. So if you see a weak data measure and it diverges from your prior, then you will change your prior less. Whereas if you see a really good data measure and it leads you to some conclusions that are quite different from your prior, then you should be changing your mind more. So this judgment about data is something absolutely critical for all of us. Yeah, I've met Roberto Rigoban in conferences. He's famous for some work on identification through heteroscedasticity. There's work that Ila Patnaik and I did where, in a way, intuitively, we reinvented some of that idea. So I have met him and discussed the Billion Prices project with him.
Beautiful. And I just sort of, another index to end the show on, which is the EIE Shirts Index, right? So there's an EIE Shirts Index where we are at 5. But we are at 5 because you are 9.5 out of 10 and I'm 0.5 out of 10. And therefore, even though I think,
No, but your shirts are cool.
I look incredibly hot in black, don't I?
Yeah, and remember we had a fruitless conversation about the same designs being sold in white.
Exactly. This was in my turn black phase, where you said turn blacks makes these great kurtas, and why don't they do it in white? And I was like, you're missing the point completely. Black is a state of mind.
No,
It
I
is
was
an
just like,
aesthetic.
with all the same hard work, you just launch one more website which is called Turn White.
Okay, turn black people, if you're watching this, I'm really sorry. I love turn black. This suggestion has nothing to do with me. But we shall endeavor to go a little higher on the index, which will only happen if I revamp my game. But I'm going to continue wearing black, I think, because I'm a vanilla kind of person. But the question to ponder on is one of attributability. That if a particular part of the economy is doing well, why is it doing well? Which aspect of it? So, if, for example, Ajay Shah looks sexy in a shirt, is it the shirt or is it Ajay? What do you think?
Of course, it's a shirt.